You're listening to Let's Talk Creation.
Well, it's fabulous to be back for another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Paul Garner and Todd Wood. I am Paul Garner.
And I am Todd Wood.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're on one of the other podcast streaming platforms. Also subscribe there and do leave us a positive review. All of that really helps us to spread the word and grow our audience. Remember to like and share our videos. Tell your friends about it. We really do appreciate all of that. Well, Todd, it's here we are back, and this episode is going to be an interesting one because it kind of came about as a result of an exhibition that I visited recently.
Yeah. Tell me about
that. So recently I went to a new exhibition, a temporary exhibition that is open at the University Library in Cambridge. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the University Library at Cambridge. It's not a particularly beautiful building. Cambridge has lots of beautiful buildings, and the University Library is not one of them. But it does have a fantastic collection. I think there are about 10 million items in the University Library. So it's a massive depository. And they were holding an exhibition called Darwin in Conversation. This is actually the exhibition guide, which I have here. The subtitle is The Endlessly Curious Life and Letters of Charles Darwin. Now, of course, our listeners and viewers, I'm sure, are somewhat familiar with who Charles Darwin is. He was born in 1809, died in 1882. He's most famously, of course, the author of On the Origin of Species and the popularizer of his theory of evolution by natural selection, one of the most famous names in the whole history of science. And this year, 2022, I understand, sees the completion of the 30-volume print edition of Darwin's correspondence, and the publication online of all of the known letters that he wrote and received during his lifetime. He was prolific. He was a prolific correspondent, and what this particular exhibition was about was bringing together a selection of his letters, his correspondence, other documents, to try to reveal something of the man himself. There are scientific letters. There were letters that he'd written to other scientists, other naturalists. There were letters to his friends and his family, where you get to see something of the personal individual. Letters to people that he knew well, and letters to people who just wrote to him and he didn't know at all. And he communicated with such a wide range of people, sort of working class pigeon breeders, aristocratic orchid collectors, and everybody in between. And so anyway, I went along to see this exhibition, and there were a couple of items in particular that I think were kind of standouts for me. One, in fact, was, and I shared this with you, Todd. You saw this. It was a copy of a child's drawing of a house.
Yeah.
Now, this drawing, it just looks like a sketch that, a modern child might have scribbled on a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. It was drawn by one of Darwin's own children. And the extraordinary thing about it is that it's on the reverse side of a handwritten page of a first draft of The Origin of Species.
Nice.
And Darwin was obviously sort of recycling his discarded notes as drawing paper for his children. And so that was one of the exhibits, which I thought was quite nice.
Or the children were recycling, as they tend to do sometimes.
Right. Yes, that's right. And one of the other highlights for me was an opportunity to see a very famous notebook, a scientific notebook that Darwin wrote. He wrote he recorded his observations and thoughts in various notebooks, and there's a very famous one called Notebook B. And it's famous because it has this iconic image of the tree of life, this little hand-drawn sketch that he drew of a phylogenetic tree. And it's just become sort of one of those iconic images. And there's a bit of a backstory to this notebook, because some of our viewers and listeners might be aware that back in January 2001, this notebook, along with another notebook, Notebook C, were found to be missing from the Darwin archives at the University Library.
Yeah, I remember the story.
Initially, they thought that they'd just misshelved it. They thought that someone had just put it back in the wrong place. And like I say, there are 10 million items in Cambridge University Library, so it's a huge collection. They made numerous searches for these missing items, never found them, and they basically came to the conclusion that they'd probably been taken, they'd been stolen. So in November 2020, the library appealed for information about the whereabouts of these missing items, and wanted information that might lead to their return. And rather incredibly, in March 2022, both notebooks were anonymously and somewhat mysteriously returned to the library. They just turned up outside the librarian's office one day in a bright pink gift bag with a note that read, "Librarian, Happy Easter, X." At least I presume it's an X and not a kiss. But anyway, so these notebooks are just returned. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know where they've been. We don't know who brought them back. But they were both on display in this exhibition. Oh. And of course, Notebook B was open at that famous Tree of Life sketch. Mm-hmm. So that was, it was a good opportunity to go and see these. I guess if any of our listeners that are here in the UK want to go and see the exhibition, it's free. It's on at the University Library in Cambridge. It opened on the 9th of July. It's running through to the 3rd of December. You can just book tickets online. If you search Darwin in Conversation, you'll probably find the website. And so it's it's worth going and having a look. And I think I'm right in saying, don't quote me on this, but I think I'm right in saying that the exhibition is going to come to the United States. Oh, somebody told me they'd heard that it was going to come to New York at some point. So you may get an opportunity to see it on the other side of the pond. So anyway, having gone to this exhibition, that kind of set us thinking that maybe an episode about the life of Charles Darwin might be a good idea. Yeah. Just to maybe set the scene about his life, his scientific work, and in particular what Darwin means for us as creationists today. Now, Todd, I know that you have read a good deal of Darwin's own work. You've read a great deal about Darwin. Mm-hmm. You've thought a lot about his life and his legacy. So why don't you sort of kick us off by telling us who Darwin is? Who is this Darwin chap anyway? So give us something of his backstory.
Yeah, well, good question. Let me preface this by saying this isn't creation, right? This is Let's Talk Creation, but we're going to do, this is kind of an odd episode. I don't think we're going to do this very often. But I think it's an interesting question. And like you say, I've done a lot of reading. I've read autobiographies. His autobiography. I've read biographies about him. I've read correspondence. The Correspondence Project. We'll make sure we link to that in the show notes so you can see some of his letters. I've gone through Darwin online more times than I can count. That's a repository of his publications. Yeah, so Darwin, as you say, was born in 1809. His father was a doctor. So he is essentially in this emerging British middle class, right? So he is not aristocracy. He is not born rich. But since his father is a doctor, he's pretty well off. And his maternal grandfather was Josiah Wedgwood. His mother was a Wedgwood. And that might not mean much to a lot of people, but if you've seen or had Wedgwood pottery, that's the Wedgwood we're talking about. That the lovely white pottery with the blue designs on it. That's Wedgwood pottery, and that's his grandfather Josiah Wedgwood was the guy who did that. So his family is pretty well off. Not, as I said, aristocracy, but they are comfortable, right? Well off. And so Darwin was sort of expected to basically follow in his father's footsteps. So he goes off to Edinburgh to study medicine, and discovers rather quickly that he does not have the stomach for medicine. He has to sit in and observe a surgery. And so at this time, this was just before the discovery of ether and anesthetic. So literally in Darwin's lifetime, by the time he is grown up to be my age, there is anesthetic for surgery. But when he's in school, basically you just had two guys holding this poor person down, and the surgeon is cutting as fast as he can. Blood is everywhere. The guy is squirming around and screaming. It's not good. And I don't blame him for wanting to pass out. So he decides in Edinburgh that he is not going to be a doctor. So what other option is there? So you basically had two other options for, the well-to-do middle-class British gentleman in those days. You could be, if you can't be a doctor, then you could be a lawyer. And Darwin had no interest in law, which I don't blame him. I have no interest in that either. And so the only other option then was sort of your basic clergyman, to join the Church of England and become some kind of clergy position there. And that would afford Darwin the opportunity to pursue some of his little hobbies. He took up beetle collecting. He had a great interest in natural history, and that was developed while he was in Edinburgh. So he eventually enrolled in Cambridge, where he basically he was training to become sort of the country parson who would take care of some sort of little Church of England flock somewhere, and then have the rest of the week to pursue his interest in natural history. And there he came in contact with Professor Henslow, who recommended him for the Voyage of the Beagle, which I think a lot of people have heard of. So this was a voyage that took place in the 1830s, 5-year voyage around the world. And its main mission was to map the coast of South America. And so this afforded Darwin the opportunity to see amazing things all over the world. He took with him books by Charles Lyell that describe geology, and Lyell basically argued that there are no sudden catastrophes, that what we see in the rock layers and the rocks that we find around us, this is the result of countless periods of time of erosion and slow changes that happen. And so Darwin had those things in mind as he was looking at these geological features on the Voyage of the Beagle. And he collected things, naturally, continued his collecting habit, collected beetles, he collected birds, he collected fossils in South America, and he would ship those back to England as he was going. And most famously, then, he spent 5 weeks in the Galapagos Islands in 1835. And he saw the giant tortoises, tried to ride one of them. He collected finches, the finches that are named for him now, Darwin's finches. He collected mockingbirds there. He visited several different islands, and then went off the rest of the voyage. After the Galapagos, they circumnavigated. They went on to New Zealand and then around the Indian Ocean and Africa and back to England. And he arrived there in beginning of 1837. And so then, basically by July of 1837, he had begun to think that species come from other species. That was essentially the insight that he had come to. And it was not a sudden eureka moment. It was a slow process of persuasion. And part of it, we think, had to do with the mockingbirds of Galapagos, not the finches. Although finches probably played part in it too. But the basic idea that Darwin had going into Galapagos was that species had an unknown origin, right? So he had already been convinced, and people had been convinced for decades at this point, that the Earth was much older than thousands of years and had been around for a very long time, who knows how long. And that when you look at the rock layers, right, you find different species in each layer. So there seemed to be this progression of species. So you would have species from one layer that disappear and they don't appear in the next layer up, and then new species appear in that layer. So the big question was, well, where do species come from? And so Lyell argued that species came from, he just called it a center of creation. Where do they come from? Creation. Was creation a doctrine or a religious opinion or something out of the Bible? Not really. It was just a shorthand for, I don't know where they come from. They come from somewhere. And so his idea was that you would have this geographic center, and then the species would spread out from there. There would be a small number of individuals that originated at that center, and they would spread out, and they would become sort of local varieties, right? So you could imagine, let's say you have a red fox that lives around here in the southern Appalachians where it is pretty hot during the summer. And then a red fox from up in Alaska where it's pretty cold year round. And so the foxes would have different attributes. They would have a lot more hair and fur up in the Arctic to keep them warm. They might have shorter limbs on average than the foxes that we have around here. They might be larger just for retaining heat in the Arctic than they would be on average here in the southern Appalachians. So that's the sort of thing that Lyell said would happen. And so Darwin collected these mockingbirds in the Galapagos, all of which are pretty similar. But his bird expert that he gave all the specimens to, his name is John Gould, he came back and said, no, Darwin, you have multiple species of mockingbird. And so you can imagine then how he might have said, well, if you had a center of creation for the mockingbirds and they sort of adapted to the local conditions, then maybe what really happened was they adapted and became different species altogether. 15 months later, he reads an essay on population by a guy named Malthus. And Malthus, he was very popular at one time, but I don't understand how this happens. But anyway, Malthus basically said, look, overpopulation is bad, leads to scarce resources. So what we should do is, the poor people obviously can't cut it in life. So we should just let them die and not help them. And rich people, well, we're the successful ones. And so we are the ones who should be having all the offspring. As I say, kind of a brutal philosophy, but very popular. And then for those of you familiar with Dickens' Christmas Carol, right? If you've ever wondered why Scrooge was so horrible, he's a Malthusian. That's Malthus. That's his ideas, right? Let them die and decrease the surplus population. That's Malthus right there. So Darwin translates that into everything else in the world. Instead of being mean and just letting poor people die, he reasoned, well, there's always scarce resources. There's never enough acorns to feed all the squirrels. There's never enough grass to feed all the horses, and so forth. There's going to be a struggle for resources. And so only the most successful creatures will be able to acquire what they need. And that's natural selection, right? So those that aren't able to be as successful as others are going to die off. And the ones that are able to get what they need are going to survive and produce offspring. So that's 1838. 1838, Darwin has the essential ingredients of his theory of evolution. Species change into other species, and they do it by natural selection. So 1842, he writes down a little short essay. And in 1844, he wrote a much longer essay, like 230 pages, that would become Origin of Species. But you'll notice there's a 15-year gap. 1844, he's got the first draft of Origin of Species. He doesn't publish that book until 1859. So what was he doing?
Yeah.
One of his friends happens to write in a letter to him. There had been the funny thing was that people had been talking about evolution all through, the late 1700s, all the way up to Darwin's publication. And most of it was pretty amateur and not very compelling. And so when another one of these things appeared in 1844, one of his friends wrote to him and said, anybody who's going to write or talk or reason about the origin of species needs to spend time actually studying species. And so Darwin kind of took that to heart and said, all right, well, I should spend some time studying species. He looked around to find a group that needed studying, settled on barnacles.
Barnacles, yeah.
So he spends a decade studying barnacles, publishes three-volume book series on barnacles. Fabulous stuff. And then he finally returns to start working on what he called his big book, which was this species theory, his evolution model. And as he's doing this guy named Alfred Russel Wallace sends him a letter in 1858, and it's basically his model of evolution by natural selection. Wallace had come up with it all on his own, and Darwin's thought, "Oh crud, I'm not even I'm not even halfway done with this big book. I don't know what's going to happen here." So
he thinks he's going to get scooped. So.
Yeah, he thinks it's all for nothing. All this work that he's done is for nothing because Wallace is going to publish ahead of me and I'm going to be left out. So his friends persuade him, here's what we'll do. We'll take Wallace's letter and we'll take some of your unpublished writings and we're going to read them at a meeting of the Linnean Society to establish that you are co-inventors of this idea. And then you need to hurry up and get that book done. So that's what they do. And Darwin then rushes to create what he called an abstract of his big book, which is the monstrously thick, ponderous reading of Origin of Species. It takes discipline to read it. Maybe not in that day. Maybe that's how Victorians wrote, but for me, it took a lot of effort to read through it. It's long,
and that's the abstract, right?
Yeah, that's the abstract. So Can you imagine what the original book would have been?
and the longer work never gets published. Is that right? So
not in Darwin's lifetime, right?
Right. Okay.
Right. So there is you could get a draft version. It's about half done, and it's quite thick. And the first 3 chapters of that book, I think the first 3 chapters get cut out and put into a book called let's see, he wrote a book on variations in domesticated and creatures. That book, 3 of those chapters are from his big book, but otherwise the big book never gets published, and the only thing that gets published is Origin. And he spends the rest of his life then, modifying Origin. That's mostly his focus. He never really finishes the big book at all. So that's 1859. That's November of 1859 when Origin of Species finally hits. The Linnean Society meeting, not really that big of a deal. Most people didn't pay much attention to it, but Origin makes a big splash. So yeah, that's the history of Darwin's thought and where it all came from.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Just come back with me to the Galapagos Islands and his observations there, just to try and sort of make this clear for people. You talked about this idea that Lyell had, these centers of creation, and Darwin in effect just said, well, what's happening is not just varieties of a species, but you're actually getting new species that are arising from these centers of creation as organisms sort of move out, migrate, end up somewhere else, and become adapted to the local environment. They essentially become new species.
Yeah.
What was it he actually saw on the Galapagos Islands that kind of had him thinking that way?
Couple of things, right?
Because you've got these mockingbirds on the Galapagos Islands. Why is he thinking that they weren't just created there on the islands? What makes him think that they're adapted to the local conditions?
Right. So, yeah, my suspicion is, when he was collecting, he, as he would later realize, he didn't have a lot of experience with species, right? So he's collecting these birds and he's thinking these birds are probably just varieties of the same mockingbird on different islands, right? So he would collect on one island and then he would go to another island and he would find a slightly different mockingbird, but it was clearly the same mockingbird. And so that's where he starts. That's what we think he started, right? Because we know just before he got to Galapagos that he received the second volume of Lyell's work, Principles of Geology. And the second volume of Lyell's book is all about where species come from, where he develops this idea of centers of creation. So we know Darwin going into the Galapagos is already thinking, it's fresh in his mind. So he's going to be reading what he sees based on how he has read Lyell. So he's got that in mind. The other thing that he sees here, it's not just the mockingbirds, right? So he also sees, the finches, but he doesn't keep good records on where he got the finches. So when he finds out that all of these weird birds that he thought were different sorts of things were really finches, he doesn't exactly have on hand all the details of where he got them. So he sort of reconstructs it based on the captain's records of the ship's voyage, where they must have been when he took this specimen. But the other thing that he notices that strikes him as really, really important is that the unique and unusual species of Galapagos all tend to resemble everything that he had been seeing the past couple years in South America, right? Because he's not just on the Beagle. The Beagle would make port. He would go ashore, and he would spend months exploring the interior of South America, and then meet up with the Beagle again to get on the boat and go on to the next big stop. So the Beagle was going up and down the coast doing all of its mapping stuff. That's boring. He didn't care about that. He was in South America exploring, so he is very familiar with the sorts of species that they have there in South America. And so when he gets to Galapagos, he realizes this looks a lot like South America. This looks like these species on the Galapagos came from South America, even though they're slightly different, right? He can tell they're not exactly the same, but they're clearly South American. So those are the sorts of things that sets him in mind. South America, these ancestors of the Galapagos creatures arrived from South America. And let's say they arrived on an island that was newly formed from volcanoes, which is where the Galapagos come from. And so these colonizers then are able to spread out into this empty environment, and they become adapted to the local conditions, and they become new species. That's basically what Darwin reasoned. And he saw it also in the mockingbirds in Galapagos, where they appeared to be clearly all the same thing, but just slightly different. And then when Gould tells him, no, these are different species, he realizes, interesting. That the center of creation idea that Lyell had works just as well if they actually go ahead and become different species rather than just varieties of the same species. So it sort of makes sense when you realize his insights here. He's not saying, humans evolved from monkeys. He's not saying that whales evolved from cows. That's not his first insight. His first insight is this mockingbird that looks just like this mockingbird, except for this minor difference. These things came from a common ancestor. And you think, that makes sense. I can see that. Right. That makes sense to me anyway. I can see how that works. It's the later stuff that he goes, well, you can extrapolate this to explain the entire fossil record, where I think, now wait a minute here. I don't know about that. But that initial flash of insight, it makes sense.
And I think you hit on an important point here, which is that, those observations of Darwin do make sense. That, and you can see how Darwin arrives at those conclusions. That seems extremely reasonable. Now, when you read On the Origin of Species, and I've worked my way through the ponderous thing. One of the things that you notice is that he's constantly contrasting his sort of evolutionary view with special creation. Yeah. He's kind of setting up this idea of special creation, and that's kind of the counter explanation for what he's looking at. And he's constantly sort of arguing that the evolutionary explanation is a better explanation.
Correct.
But that kind of begs the question a bit. What did Darwin think the special creation explanation was?
Right.
Because that's kind of the fool guy, isn't it, in Darwin's book? So what is he talking about when he says special creation in the book?
And that question has been a big question for a lot of historians trying to understand this, right? It's easy for a modern biologist to read Origin and just fall right in with Darwin's reasoning and go, oh yeah, those special creationists, they don't know nothing. But when you start to realize, okay, well, what were the different views about the origin of species at the time? There were actually several different ideas, including evolutionary ideas. And so Darwin's clearly has in his mind one particular view, and it's most likely the center of creation idea, that each individual species, those mockingbirds that are just slightly different and found only on certain islands in the Galapagos and not on other islands, each one of those was specially created by God for the environment in which you find it. That's basically his idea of special creation. So for him, he looks at the Galapagos and says, okay, this is the only place you find these mockingbirds in the world. And these two species that are so similar to one another are only found here. They're found on different islands in the Galapagos. And you're telling me that has no explanation whatsoever other than God just made it that way. And Darwin says, I think it's easier to assume that there was an ancestral mockingbird, and the reason you only find them there in the Galapagos is that ancestral mockingbird arrived there and diverged and became multiple mockingbird species. So his idea of special creation is really, really strict, right? And it's honestly not a biblical idea, right? It's not, there's nothing about the flood. There's nothing about recolonizing the world after the flood. There's nothing about exactly how God made things in the beginning or anything like that. It's only about each species originates in a particular location. And it is, the other thing about it is that each species is perfectly adapted and designed by God to do what it does. So there's no creationist history. There's no flood. There's no creation or fall or anything like that. It's only about where you find the species and the kinds of attributes that they have.
Yeah. So in effect, I mean, from the perspective of, say, a modern creationist biologist, when you read The Origin, Darwin is kind of arguing against a bit of a straw man. It's not a position that creationists actually hold.
Right.
At least today. But that was kind of the position that he sets himself up to have this long argument. And that's what The Origin is. It's one single long argument against this special creation position, which is essentially sort of linked to the idea of species fixity, which is, as you say, is not really a biblical idea. Doesn't come from the Bible. The Bible doesn't even talk about species.
No.
It talks about created kinds, and the Bible seems to imply actually that the kinds have had a pretty dynamic history. In terms of what happened at the time of the fall. And dietary changes, and then, as you say, the changes at the time of the flood and post-flood recovery and migration and all of that. So, so that's really, really interesting. So we've got Darwin's publication, 1859, Origin of Species, comes out. What are the reactions to Origin of Species? Is there fierce resistance? Do people very quickly adopt Darwin's ideas? How does that go?
It's all over the map. It's all of the above. It is famously controversial, but I think to some extent the controversy is exaggerated a bit, and I think it's exaggerated because everybody still has this idea in mind that somehow Christians were wildly against and protested and everything. Some of that happened, definitely. But there were also a lot of people who went right along with Darwin, right? So, so the main hang up that most people had is human evolution, which is kind of funny because Darwin barely mentions it in Origin. Just one little sentence sort of at the very end, kind of tucked away. Maybe this will cast light on the origins of our own species. That's all he says. Everyone is obsessed with human evolution, and it becomes the big argument and topic of the day. No one is interested or fooled by any of the other stuff. They're not gonna they don't really care about where plants come from or animals or anything like that. They care about people. And yes, there is
things haven't changed very much, Todd.
No.
Because you and I know that when you talk about origins issues today, that's kind of the hot button topic that really gets people going. That's you can press the button and watch them go. And nobody's interested in sort of beetles and mockingbirds.
Yep.
They want to know about human evolution. Yeah,
that's all fine. They'll shrug that off. Who cares? But human evolution, don't even start with me, right? So people get all up in arms, and so yes, there was some initial resistance. T.H. Huxley then becomes one of Darwin's chief defenders, and he has the famous debate with the bishop Wilberforce, and that goes down as kind of becomes kind of a founding myth, right? Where this big fight between the church and Darwin. But a lot of people were ready for Darwin, frankly. They had for centuries believed that science could be and should be done independently of religious interference. And therefore, the findings of science were telling us about God's world. So there were people already lined up philosophically with Darwin. And when Darwin showed this Origin of Species, or published Origin of Species, they just said, well, this is how God created. This is the mechanism of God's creation, is evolution, which sounds to us really weird. It doesn't make any sense. Creation is a sudden thing, and it has a particular meaning. But if you're just thinking of creation in a theological sense, meaning that God made something, then yeah, that's where they would say, well, that's how, evolution is how God made stuff. And so by 1875, pretty much all of the sort of scholarly scientific folk in the UK had agreed that Darwin was probably right. There's agreement in the US, but obviously 1859, publication of Origin of Species, we were fighting our Civil War right after that. So there's a lot to distract American scholars from right. Commenting on evolution. The hot debate and topic of the day was slavery and the Civil War, and how, eventually then, restoration of the South, restoration of the Union, and so forth. So it's a little less clear, and we do have holdouts in the U.S., but we also have champions. Gray is a famous champion of Darwin, famous theistic evolution.
Asa Gray, yeah.
He was American. But Louis Agassiz, famous, totally rejected Origin. He rejected even the centers of creation. He believed that species were created exactly where you find them, completely filling their range. So there is no variation. They are completely permanent. But otherwise, we can point to these holdouts, but for the most part, people are largely convinced by 1875. What they didn't buy into was natural selection, right? Yeah. So natural selection
that's
it's terribly
that's kind of ironic.
Yeah.
Because as I understand it, Darwin didn't think that people would buy into the idea of his evolutionary theory if he couldn't propose a mechanism.
Correct.
And actually what happened was people very quickly adopted his evolutionary ideas but rejected his mechanism.
Didn't buy the mechanism at all.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And it's weird because Darwin writes Origin in that way, right? He opens with chapters that explain natural selection and how natural selection works. And then he says, you play that out over millions of years or countless of periods of time, and you're going to get these things. And so then he goes over how evolution is supposed to explain the fossil record, how evolution is supposed to explain the distribution of species, and so on. Which is odd. So the sorts of evidence that convinced Darwin in the first place of that species come from other species gets put in the back of the book. And the stuff that people think, I don't think that really works, that's the sort of stuff that ends up in the front of the book. So, and there are people who, there are historians who claim that, he's arguing backwards. He is definitely arguing backwards from the way that he came to think about evolution. He became convinced that evolution happened first, then he came to this mechanism. And so then when he writes Origin, he writes it the other way around. So it's weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting. Okay. We probably should just start to wind things up a bit.
Yeah.
But I wanted to kind of end with perhaps a provocative question.
Good.
Was Darwin a bad guy? He is to many creationists, he is kind of the bête noire, of our movement.
That's right.
And a huge amount of effort goes into sort of try and discredit Darwin and, his ideas, his expertise, even his personality, and he's just fair game. How should we assess Darwin as creationists?
I personally, having read his works and studied what he has to say, I have a certain sympathy for him, certainly on a personal level. He had a difficult life. He came back from the Beagle with a chronic illness that was never really diagnosed. That was pretty debilitating. It would leave him sometimes weeks at a time unable to get out of bed and do anything. Certainly not really able to travel much. And he lost his daughter Annie, 10-year-old daughter, probably to tuberculosis. And that's a tough thing to take as a parent, to lose a child. That's just a brutal, brutal experience to live through. And I have some sympathy with his ideas about creation, right? This notion, his very simplistic and naive understanding of what creation is really isn't very satisfying. And so I can see how Darwin, if he thought that was what creation was, would think this doesn't explain much of anything, right? And where we part company is his conclusions to all of these sorts of things. His conclusion that, I cannot accept, for example, I cannot accept Christianity. I do not accept the idea of a God who would punish people in hell or punish people because they don't believe in him. He just thought that was unacceptable. I don't agree. I am a Christian. I do believe that God punishes and will punish the wicked, and that our only hope is to turn to him for salvation in Christ Jesus. That's it. So for him to look at essentially his need for salvation and say, I don't need that. And your idea of a God is a bad God. I won't go there. And certainly his ideas that, if you take natural selection over countless periods of time, you're going to explain the whole fossil record and all of living, all the diversity of living things that we have today. No. Partly because I don't think evolution can actually do that. But also because that's not what God has told us about the origin of the world and the origin of the real origin of creatures. So, two levels there where I don't agree. So I can personally look at him and say this is he had a rough life and I can see why he came to the sorts of conclusions that he did, but he came to the wrong conclusions. The conclusions were incorrect. Now I
think you can see.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think you can see through Darwin's life the promptings of God.
Oh, I think so.
There are times when Darwin comes into contact with Christians, even evangelicals. His wife Emma, who was very unorthodox because she was a Unitarian, but nevertheless, she pointed him to the scriptures. She pointed him to the Bible. And yet Darwin, and I think Darwin was deeply troubled, by that.
Yeah.
And yet over time, I think you see a kind of hardening of Darwin's heart, a kind of shutting himself off from God. And the death of his daughter played a role in that, a big role. And I just think when I look at the life of Darwin, I don't get, I suppose I don't feel angry about it. I actually find it rather a sad story. I find it quite a tragic story in many ways, quite a moving story. And, you know, you think how things could have been so different if he'd actually listened to the promptings of God in his life. And so I think we can be nuanced, can't we? We can recognize that Darwin was right about some things and wrong about a lot of other things. Mm-hmm. But take away some lessons, you know, that we need to embrace biblical authority because it's God's word, and not reject it as Darwin did. And if we do that, then we actually are given some answers to some of the big questions of life that really deeply troubled Darwin. And it's a reminder, I think, not to harden our hearts by resisting God, but to keep listening to God, to keep praying, keep seeking Him. So I think there are some lessons that we should learn. And like I say, I just find it quite a sad story, really, in many ways.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think the big lesson, you know, salvation is the most important thing, right? The most important thing that we can do, regardless of what you think about species or evolution or any of that other stuff. The work of Jesus Christ on the cross to save sinners from the just and fair punishment of a righteous God. That's the most important thing that we need to react to, and that we need to accept. That is a free gift of grace, and Darwin just decided, no, the whole thing is a scam and it's unfair and it doesn't make any sense, and I'm not going there. That is the wrong choice. That is definitely the wrong choice. And so, I think that does make me sad. Just as it would make me sad that anybody rejects the gospel of Jesus Christ. Yeah. Well, perhaps that's a good place to end, to wind up this episode. I don't know what the next episode is going to hold. We haven't quite sorted out the details yet, but come back in a couple of weeks' time to find out. We'll have something interesting lined up for you. Do remember all of our streaming platforms and show notes are available at coresci.org/podcasts, so check us out there. We love to get your questions and comments, so send those to us by email at podcast@coresci.org. Another reminder to subscribe, hit the notification bell, like and share our episodes, leave us a positive review. We do appreciate all of that. And of course, we can only keep the podcasts coming through the support of our viewers and listeners. So Todd, how do people support Core Academy of Science?
You can visit coresi.org/donate, and that will have all the information that you need to make a contribution to us here in the U.S., and that money will then go to support for future production of Let's Talk Creation.
That's great. And the other sponsor of the podcast is Biblical Creation Trust. We're based in the UK. We have a website at biblicalcreationtrust.org. There's a donate button on our homepage. You can click on that. Takes you to all of the information you need to find ways to give to support the work of BCT and the work of the podcast. So do check that out. And I guess we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time when who knows what we're going to be covering, but it's going to be fun, I'm sure.
All right.
So we'll see you then.
See you then.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.